Women have been in this role since the beginning of time to support our children and to support our husbands. And it's not as if she didn't go along with him. You know, she was a part of what he was doing.
Because in modern times, people have basically done everything before they got married. When they have their wedding, they suffer from a depression afterwards because it's like an anticlimax. She, in this documentary, she said, well, liberation didn't happen. And she said sexual liberation didn't happen. She said what happened was commercial pornography was liberated, fantasy was liberated, but people weren't liberated.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Tammy Peterson podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Sheikha Fatima Barkatulla. Sheikha Fatima Barkatulla is an Islamic scholar and director of Muslim Womanhood, an organization set up to educate and build resilience in Muslim women in the West. Fatima was born and grew up in London, where she lives with her husband and 4 children. She studied classic Arabic in Egypt and completed her Islamic education at seminaries in the UK. She went on to complete her master's degree in Islamic Law and was awarded the Doreen Hinchcliffe Memorial Prize for Best Performance in her year. Fatima and I had a good conversation. It was very kind of her to come on my podcast. I hope that you enjoy today's conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hello, Fatima. Nice to see you again. Thank you for coming on my podcast.
Hi, Tammy. It's lovely to see you again.
So we met in London. How long ago was that? Do you remember? It's just a few months ago.
Yeah, I think, wasn't it November?
November, I believe that's
yes.
right. Yeah, so we came and visited your mosque.
Yeah.
Your new mosque, a beautiful mosque in London.
Yes.
And we talked and you agreed to come on my podcast. And since then, I read your book.
Oh, wow. Great.
And I don't know if I'll pronounce it properly, but Khadijah, is that how you say her name?
Khadijah?
Khadijah.
Oh, yes.
Khadijah,
yes.
mother of history's greatest nation. And so you wrote
Khadijah.
that book and I read it. And when I was reading it, I thought, oh, this is about Muhammad's life. But then once I read the whole book, I realized, oh, no, this is about Muhammad's wife's life.
Yes,
and
exactly.
So maybe you could tell the people who are listening, the guests of my podcast, why you wrote this book and what it's about. What point were you trying to make when you wrote it, and how long ago you wrote it? What inspired you? You know, all of that.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Tammy, first of all. It was really nice to meet you and Professor Peterson in London. And we really appreciated, the opportunity to actually just get together, really. So thank you for reading my book. Yes, so the book, Khadijah, is about the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. She's his first wife. And essentially, I wrote it because there's actually very few books in the English language about some of the great, women, the female figures from Islamic history. And one of the things I think a lot of parents especially were feeling was that they'd love for their daughters in particular, to be able to read about the women, not just their daughters, actually, their sons as well, just to be able to read about some of the women from our history. And I think growing up, my dad, he used to try and get as many books as he could in the English language about Islamic history and things like that, just so that we would get to know our own history, our past, etc. But often it was a translation, so it wasn't really it wasn't in very good English. It wasn't very inspiring in the way it was written, simply because it was a translation usually. So I think I really wanted to bring the life of this great lady, especially to younger people. But what I found is that a lot of women, Muslim and non-Muslim women, are reading the book as well, and finding out about her. The thing is that the research I had to do was in Arabic as well. Mm-hmm. So because I've studied Arabic, I went to Egypt and I learnt Arabic, classical Arabic. It meant that I could delve into those, historical books and sources and bring out little stories and things like that.
Tell us as far back as you can. Were you born in the UK?
Yeah. So my
and
parents
raised
are,
in the UK? Mm-hmm.
My parents are originally from India. They came to the UK in the 70s, and I was born like just before the 80s, basically, just on the cusp of the 80s, and in London. Yeah, so I'm a Londoner. I've been a Londoner all my life, and I think at that time there, we were just. I didn't know any better. I grew up in two different areas of London. Half of my childhood I was in quite an impoverished area of London, very multicultural, in a sort of estate, what we call an estate, like a council estate, which is probably like the projects, something like that in America. But then we moved when I was about 10 or 11 to quite an affluent part of London, which was like the complete opposite. And so I grew up in an area where there were a lot of middle-class people, very few ethnic minorities. And I went to secondary school there, to a girls' school, which was, very mixed, girls of all backgrounds. So yeah, I had a very happy childhood in London. But yeah, the reason why I wrote the book was I often looked for female role models, and the only role models that we were always given were, a certain type. There was always a certain type. And I think with Khadijah, she was such a pivotal part of the Prophet Muhammad's journey and his life. Maybe I can tell your listeners a little bit about her.
Yes,
because I don't think a lot of people realize. So she was a wealthy lady. So maybe I should go back a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Nope.
The Prophet Abraham, he came to Mecca with his son Ishmael. Obviously, there was no Mecca at that time. It was just a desert. And what he brought his son Ishmael there with his mother Hagar. I think that's how you pronounce it in English. We call her Hajar. And God had commanded him to leave them there in the middle of the desert. So Hagar and Ishmael were left in the desert, and there they looked for water. They couldn't find it. Hagar went from one hill to another. There are these two hills called Safa and Marwa. And she went from one hill to another looking desperately for water for herself because her milk had dried up for her little baby.
Oh, he's a baby.
Yeah, he was a baby. And what happened was that suddenly an angel appeared and struck the ground near the feet of the baby, Ishmael. And water began gushing forth. And Hagar, she saw this water and she started to gather it together. She was afraid it's all going to flow away into the desert. So she said the word Zamzam, which means stop, stop. And that well still exists today. It's called the Well of Zamzam. Was the foundation of the city of Mecca. Because now there was water there.
Right.
And so some traveling Arabs were passing by and they asked Hagar if they could settle there because there was water. And she said yes. And so that's really how the city of Mecca came about, literally.
Right. Oh, that's a great story.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful story. And so centuries later, the Prophet Muhammad was born from the same family of Ishmael. So he was a descendant of Ishmael, a direct descendant of Ishmael. And his clan or his tribe were known as the Quraysh. The Quraysh are direct descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. And so he was like, they were the most prominent and noble family in Arabia. And Khadijah was also from that same family, from that same tribe. So they were known, they were wealthy, they were like celebrities almost, very celebrated for their nobility, for their status, for their truthfulness, especially the Prophet Muhammad. He was known as a very truthful man. He was an orphan. He grew up as an orphan. His mother passed away when he was 6 years old, and his father passed away while she was pregnant. So he was an orphan. He was brought up by his grandfather. So he lived, even though he was from a noble family, because he was an orphan, I think he was a very sensitive person. He had a very sensitive personality, looked after by the father figures in his family. And when he came of age, when he was about 25 years old, he was looking for work, and as young men do. And Khadijah, she owned one of the largest caravans in Mecca. Okay, a caravan is basically not a caravan like we, when I used to hear the word caravan as a kid, I used to imagine these like things on wheels, but no, a caravan is obviously a train of camels that are carrying lots of goods. And what the Arabs used to do is they used to take goods from Damascus and the Eastern Roman Empire, and they used to travel through the desert, bring those goods to Mecca for pilgrimage. There was a pilgrimage even at that time, and they used to take all the goods to Yemen, buy things from Yemen that probably came from India and all over the world, and then travel back. So they had this annual kind of journey that they would make, winter and summer, and that's how they kind of used to trade and make their money. And Khadijah and every noble family in that city had a caravan. Anyone who wanted to make money, anyone who had any kind of business, they wanted a stake in that kind of summer and winter journey to Damascus and Yemen. So she had a very big caravan, but she didn't want to be the one who's obviously traveling back and forth. She wanted to hire young men to do that for her. And so, but the young men who usually worked for her, they were always kind of swindling her. So she couldn't find like a really honest young man. And she had heard about Muhammad, and he was known as Al-Amin, which, the Arabs, they used to have different titles for people. They would call people by different titles based on their attributes. So because he was always known for his very fair business dealings and truthfulness, and also because he was quite known for not taking part in the worship of idols.
Idols, yes, right.
Okay, he was very much, he wanted to follow the way of Abraham, which was, to worship the Creator alone. So because he was known for these things, he was known as Al-Amin, which means the trustworthy, the honest and trustworthy. So she heard about this, so she thought, well, that's what I need, somebody who's honest and trustworthy. And so she asked him if he would go into business with her and take her caravan all the way to Damascus, and then, etc. And so he did. And when he did, he made a lot of money for her. He was obviously very good at it. And she was so pleased. And I think that's when she started having feelings for him. She started thinking. She was a widow, by the way. She was a widow, right. And she was older than him. In the history books, it says that she was about 40 and he was about 25. But, she was really, she sent a proposal for him, basically. She sent somebody to kind of ask, and then he came with his uncle with a proposal. He thought, why would anyone want to marry me? I'm quite poor compared to other people, because, he was an orphan, he'd grown up an orphan, etc. But Khadijah was looking for his qualities, and she obviously really liked him. And so they got married, and that's how they got married. And later on, they went on to have 4 children. They had more than 4 children, but 2 of them passed away. And Khadijah was very pivotal on that day when Muhammad, for the first time, the Prophet Muhammad, even before he became a prophet, he was very troubled by what was going on in his society. There was a real kind of class system. The weak were always treated very badly. There were different levels of people in society, and the strong would take advantage of the weak. The rich would swindle the poor. There was all that kind of thing going on. Plus, it really troubled him that the Kaaba, which is, people will see that big, usually it's a black box that you see in Mecca. This was essentially a building. It's just a building, a cube building that was built by Abraham and Ishmael originally for the worship of the one God. But over time, what had happened is people, because this is like Abraham was like thousands of years ago, people had brought idols from different cities and different places and had filled the Kaaba, the cube building, which was meant to be a place of worship for God alone. They had filled it with idols. And so the Arabs had become people who worshipped these idols. There were like 300 idols, believe it or not, either surrounding the Kaaba and inside the Kaaba. And this troubled him as well, because there were some Arabs, even at that time, who believed that, that we should be on the religion of Abraham, that the religion of Abraham was the religion from God, that God had sent messengers throughout time. Moses, Jesus, Noah, Abraham, all of these prophets, they came essentially with the same message, which was worship God alone, devote your life to God on his terms. And that's how you can live a good life and be successful in the hereafter. So there were a core number of people who believed that, even amongst the Arabs, and the Prophet Muhammad was one of them. And because he felt so troubled, he used to go to a mountain near Mecca. It's still there. You can actually visit it. And this mountain, now it's called the Mountain of Light, Jabal Nur. He used to go there just to sit alone and meditate. He really wanted to reach out to God, and he was troubled by what was happening in his society, and he just felt some kind of solace from going there. And Khadijah used to help him. She used to deliver food to him. She kind of really understood him and his need for this meditation, which is quite amazing. Like, you can see that they had a real love, a real connection. And one day he comes home and there's a knock on the door, and Khadijah is, she's like, what's happening? It's nighttime. And she's been worried about him. He's been gone for like 2 or 3 days. And he comes into the house and he says, he's shivering. And this is also mentioned in the Quran. He's shivering. And he says, wrap me up. And she says, okay. She just brings blankets for him and she wraps him up. And she's just like waiting to hear, what's happened. And she said to him, what's happened? And he says to her, I was sitting in the cave. There's a cave there in the mountain. And an angel came to me in the form of a man. A man came, basically, and held me and said to me, read. read. Iqra, in Arabic, Iqra. And I said to him, I can't read, because in those times, they didn't learn to read or write. Only some people knew how to read and write. So the Prophet Muhammad, he was unlettered. He was an unlettered person. He didn't know how to read. So he's thinking, why is this person asking me to read? And the person repeated again, read. And he said, I can't read. And he said, read. But then the Prophet Muhammad realized he meant recite after me. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. And this is one of the first revelation in the Quran, the word of God. And the Prophet Muhammad memorized these words, and he repeated after the angel. The angel said to him, I am the angel Gabriel. And but the Prophet Muhammad was very dazed. He was very shocked at this experience, because the angel then held him very close and like squeezed him very hard and then let him go. And the Prophet Muhammad started to head back home. And as he was going, he looked behind him and he saw Gabriel in his original form, filling the horizon. He said he filled the horizon. And, you know, he just kept telling him that, I'm Gabriel and you are the messenger of God. And so when the Prophet Muhammad told Khadijah this story, she said, let's go to my uncle. Let's go to my uncle, Waraqah, who is an expert in the scriptures, in the Christian scriptures and the Jewish scriptures, the Torah and the Injil. That's what we call them in Arabic. He was another one of those people who were known as the Hanifs, the people who followed the way of Abraham. Waraqah. So, and he was very wise, and he had read a lot. So they went to him to ask him, you know, what's going on? What is this? How should we interpret this? And Waraqah said, if only I was a young man. I wish I was a young man so I could help you when your people throw you out. And they were like shocked. What do you mean that when our people throw us out, when our people persecute us? He said, this is the same angel that came to the prophets before. And anyone who has this message is always persecuted by their people.
Right.
That's what he said. And I think in that moment, Khadijah and Muhammad realized that their status and their lives were going to change profoundly. So that's just the beginning of the story, you know, just to give everyone a taster. But you can see that then, obviously, when the Prophet Muhammad started to preach this message, you know, the return to the worship of God alone, the Creator, away from the worship of idols, away from, you know, enslavement to anything but God. His people did persecute him. You know, he was not only persecuted verbally, but also physically. Anyone who followed him did so in secret initially. You know, they would have secret meetings in Mecca, and people would have to do it in hiding until a few of the more upper class Arabs started to accept his message. Then, you know, the leaders in Mecca, they became very upset, very angry. They threw the Prophet Muhammad and his family out of their homes, and they had to live in these tents in the part of the desert, and they were boycotted. Nobody was allowed to buy and sell from them. Nobody was allowed to marry into them. Nobody was allowed to give them anything. Of course, some people secretly used to do that, you know, but they went through these years of starvation and hardship until, and really it was after that time of starvation and hardship that Khadijah actually passed away. But of course, she had been very pivotal in the journey, because she, being a wealthy lady and being Muhammad's greatest champion, greatest cheerleader, she was the one who funded and supported his message. You know, when he was trying to invite people, he would have feasts and banquets just to kind of invite the people and be kind to them and convey the message to them. Also, he would free slaves. So at that time there was slavery, and he would free them. And, you know, because he was trying to change the social order as well, you know, of the society. And all of that, a lot of that was funded by people like Khadijah. And so when she passed away, he named that year the year of sadness, the year of grief. And, you know, they say he was never really the same again. She was very important to him. So yeah, I wanted to encapsulate her story, you know, in this book.
Well, I see her from my point of view. I see her as like you said, that she was a champion of his ideas, and in her place as his wife, she supported him. She made sure that he had what he needed to go further in his work. And you know, this is the same sort of this is actually the same sort of thing that is cherished in our traditional society, is that the mother and wife is in the supportive role. And, you know, he's not going to, your husband isn't going to be as successful if you're not in support of his effort to go in a direction that is inspired, hopefully by the good, by God. And so, you know,
Definitely.
And as you know, women have been in this role since the beginning of time, to support our children and to support our husbands. And it's not as if she didn't go along with him.
Yeah.
You know, she was a part of what he was doing while she was alive. And
yeah, absolutely.
I think we've forgotten in our society, largely, we've forgotten that is a good place to be, or the place to be.
I think sadly in our society now, women and men are pit against each other. You know, so we're in competition. It's like we're competing with each other rather than being on the same team. And rather than seeing ourselves as being complementary to one another, right? Because that idea that a woman support her husband and vice versa, the idea doesn't diminish her status. Do you know what I mean?
No, in fact, it's hard to tell what improves her status other than that. Really.
Wow.
You know, because men, their status, they find their status among other men. So there will be a man who's put to the top by the other men. But women, how do we find our status, or how have we found our status? And that's a curious question of something that we need to meditate on. Is
definitely
where does our status come from? And historically, we've been wives and mothers, and our status comes from our place in our families and in our societies, in our communities.
Yeah. And absolutely. And it's an honored position. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
That's a place of honor. That's a place where we were always valued. And unfortunately, I think we've lost that now. You know, like the idea that your success has to be something that is all about yourself, you know?
Right. You know, and we were always in that supportive role. We knew how to support. So we definitely know how to support ourselves. But if we're supporting ourselves and we're not supporting our husband, then what happens to our husbands if they're not having that support anymore? Because it's not easy to go out into the world and to make a difference all on your own. It's better if you have the help.
Yeah,
go
what's
ahead.
ended up happening is we're both doing double shifts, right? Like,
Right.
I think that's
Right.
what's ended up happening. Like,
Yeah.
because we are trying to compete with one another and trying to fulfill each other's roles almost.
Mm-hmm.
It means we end up doing double the work, or it ends up meaning that there's sometimes resentment, there's sometimes a lack of clarity, I think,
Yeah, well,
about what
if you're
exactly.
going to be if you're going to be in a competition, there's those kind of things are going to come up, aren't
Exactly.
they?
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think that embracing our role as the backbone of the family,
Yes.
will, I think when women stopped doing that, I think that's when families started to fall apart.
Absolutely.
The next generation didn't expect it anymore. I mean, I think it's probably also down to this kind of individualism, this
Yeah.
this idea that the individual is the most important unit of society, rather than the family, or rather than the community. So
Yeah, and that makes me think that if it's all individual between men and women, then that leaves children to be individuals as well. And then
yeah,
who is going to be there to protect those children and to guide them forward in time if everyone is
absolutely.
only in it for themselves?
Well, I think that's where, like, I do really value some of the aspects of the Muslim teachings that I think are still very much present, very much
Mm-hmm.
preserved, even in Muslim communities who are in Western countries. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that you are committed to your parents, even like for life. You
Mm-hmm.
have a certain
Mm-hmm.
commitment to your parents for life. The idea that children are to be looked after, that by the whole family. It takes a village to raise a child.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, my parents, they don't live very far away. When I am older, I expect, and I think I've brought up my children to be the sort of children who will always be there for me, just as
Mm-hmm.
I was there for them. And that's not something that wider society necessarily teaches. I think
No,
there's a lot
that's
of
right.
I think I heard you discussing, I think it was with Louise Perry,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of kinship support. How women used to have this kind of real, they were always men basically who had their back. you know
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately now, so many girls, and I think this is one of the reasons why I set up the organization Muslim Womanhood. I wanted to share the Islamic ideals about womanhood, about community and society, with not just Muslim women, to help them feel more kind of resilient and more committed, but also with the wider society. Because, Tammy, I grew up in a school where I saw a lot of things that troubled me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I went to school mostly with white girls.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just mentioning that just so you can kind of picture it. I
Mm-hmm.
did wear a scarf at school, just a headscarf. So
Mm-hmm.
I did come from a religious family,
Mm-hmm.
and I chose to wear the hijab.
Mm-hmm.
So I did stand out a little bit, um, especially in the 80s and 90s. But
And what was it like to stand out like that? Did it make any changes for you in the school?
you know, my teachers were wonderful. My teachers were
That's
always really
good.
wonderful, and in my school, my parents just, I think we just talked to them and said, is it okay if Fatima wears a scarf, at school with the uniform?
Mm-hmm.
We all had uniforms as well.
Right.
I had the longest skirt. Everyone used to like roll up the
Mm-hmm.
skirts. That was the thing to do, right? So if you see the school
Mm-hmm.
photos, it's like everyone's skirts are like, and then mine is like right on the bottom. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
so I stood out in that way, But
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
people were curious, like my teachers would sometimes ask me, And I think I was a really good student, so like a straight A student. So I think everyone was like always cheering me on, and I had a really good experience at school.
Oh, that's
The
good.
only thing is, I think sometimes, like one of my friends, one girl in my class, she told me once that her mum saw me once and said, I don't think you should hang out with girls like her. Okay, there was that, a bit of that. But then conversely, I had friends whose parents were so happy when they saw that they were going out with me, because because they knew, okay, they don't drink, they don't, she's probably not going to go to a pub, she's not going to. There's certain types of places that I will probably not go to, being a practicing Muslim. So they felt really safe that they're, if I was with them, because I wasn't really part of that, certain elements of the wider culture. So yeah, I had a very good experience at school overall. But the things that troubled me were things like, Tammy, I remember a day when one of my best friends, I'll change her name, Lucy, I'll call her Lucy. She took me aside and she said, Fatima, I really want to talk to you. And I said, okay. We went into one of the classrooms and she started crying. And I was like, what's going on? What's happening? And she said, every day after school, that the girls would go up to a boys' school. There's a boys' school up the road. And she said, we're all expected to do certain sexual favors for the boys. And I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. And she said, they're spreading rumors about me. They're calling me, and I had never heard of this word at that time, not used in this context, but she said, they're calling me frigid. And they're spreading rumors about me because I don't want to take part, And I remember that was the first time, because it sounds a bit strange, but I wasn't part of that culture. Do you know what I mean? I wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that, like, when you're wearing a hijab, obviously I didn't have my face covered, but when you're dressed in a modest way, right, and dressed in the way that I think women of God have dressed through the centuries, it tends to send a certain message, doesn't it? Like,
yes,
to society and to people. They treat you with actually a lot of respect as well, because they kind of recognize that you're giving a certain signal, right? So I wasn't part of that kind of culture of boys, and but also I didn't have an insight into it until that day. And I think what she opened my eyes up to was that although society kept telling us that women have never had it so good, right? There was this pressure, this hidden pressure that was still there. Actually, it was probably worse than it had ever been, to basically take part, be sexually active at a very young age. We're talking teenagers here, 13 and plus, to be very sexually active, very, very, to always put across this image of that you're not a virgin, for example, that you're fully like available and willing, ready and willing. And my poor friend, who, she was just a lovely girl, she wasn't particularly religious. She was, she was just a normal English girl. And she just wanted to be a girl. She just wanted to go to school and just wanted to live her life, and when she was ready, she'd find a partner, whatever. But what was happening is these girls, I realized they had a competition. There was this competitive thing going on between the girls. The girls who were the most promiscuous or the most kind of sexually advanced,
provocative,
but also seen to have done more. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, have gone further.
Advanced, yeah, right.
Yes.
or experienced, I guess it would be.
Yes.
Something like that.
They were they had a certain status,
Yes. Yeah.
And this was at a time in London, in UK, when teen pregnancies Britain was the country in Europe that had the highest teen pregnancies. And by the way, I got married when I was like 19. So I remember when I got married, I thought, it's not teen pregnancies that's a problem. It's pregnancies outside of marriage where there's no kind of, there's no prospect of any child that's born, etc., of being looked after properly,
Right.
where people are
Right.
not prepared for this,
Giving the
etc.
baby the best chance possible. Yes.
Yeah. And so because teen pregnancies were such a big topic in those days, another thing that the teachers were doing at school, which was trying to put us off motherhood, which is quite interesting. Yeah. I'll tell you something. I mean, this sounds like a bit of a scary social experiment, but I remember we used to have this class once a week that was like to do with, sex and relationships and things like that. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in one of the classes, the teacher gave each of us an egg, okay, a raw egg to look after for the week.
Oh yeah. I think we had to do this experiment too. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Did you? Wow.
Yeah.
I thought whenever I tell people about it, they look at me like, what? What kind of social experiment was your school doing, But we had to carry this egg for the whole week. So we had to wrap it up in cotton wool and we were supposed to keep it in our backpacks, right?
The boys and the girls, right? Or just the girls?
Well, it was a girls' school, so...
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I don't know.
So for me, it would have been the boys and the girls.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we were supposed to carry it all week and, and I remember at the time thinking, what is this all about? But I guess the whole point of it was to say, it's not easy being a mother. It's not easy. Apparently the egg is supposed to represent a baby.
Yeah.
And, that responsibility.
Right. Putting something else before ourselves.
Yeah. And so the whole idea was to kind of put everyone off, the idea
you think
of...
so? Oh, you think so?
Yeah, because teen pregnancies, like I said, teen pregnancies was such a big problem.
Oh, I see what you mean. Not putting themselves off motherhood, but putting them off of promiscuity. Yes?
Well, I remember there was a class where we had a discussion about that. Mm-hmm. And the teacher stopped short of saying, well, there's always abstinence, like she couldn't quite say that,
Oh, right.
Like, because it was kind of like, oh, that would be so prudish or whatever, right? But I remember sitting there thinking, well, there is the option of not having a relationship, but they were all, no, at that time, I think it was all about safe sex, that's the main message that was being given.
Right.
But this particular thing, I think the idea was for girls not to idealize motherhood, like, think of motherhood as like something, I don't know. There was this thing, I remember we watched a video where girls who think that having a baby, they'll get love from that. And they're not thinking about the long-term consequences, etc. Anyway, this whole thing gave me an insight into like another world. And I think there were some Christian girls at the school as well, actually, some religious Christian girls who, like Vicar's daughter, and I remember one of my friends was a Methodist. They were always drawn to each other, I think, because I think they really respected the fact that I was willing to externally show my religiosity. Do you know what I mean?
Right, right.
And I think sometimes they felt that they couldn't do that. Simply because they would be made fun of, quite simply,
Yes.
Whereas
yes, that's something we have to deal with if we're going to be different, or if we're going to stand for an ethical standard that other people aren't even actually thinking about. Not even, it's not even on their radar as important anymore, which is, that's a lost place as far as I'm concerned.
I think the like one of my friends, she took me to her church as well, her dad's church. And yeah, we just had this real affinity because, you know,
Yeah.
we knew that we cared about the same sorts of things.
Right, exactly.
But I do think even they found it quite hard to navigate like their place in society, you know, because on the outside they looked and would be treated just like everyone else, but actually they were trying to live by a different set of values. And unfortunately, in Britain, I don't know if you know the famous quote, one of the spin doctors of Tony Blair, because we grew up in the time of Tony Blair, right? He said to him, you know, we don't do God, right? This is like a thing in Britain, you know, don't talk about God, don't mention God, and we don't do God, right? That's a very British thing, unfortunately. It's always really surprising to Brits, I think, when they see Americans, like how much they're actually willing to even talk about God, you know, in God we trust, and even just verbalize it. So yeah, that's the kind of atmosphere we grew up in. And I just felt really sad, actually, you know, like when my friend, when that happened to her, and I got this insight into this world where they felt very pressured and very, you know, before they were ready to basically give such a precious part of themselves away, you know?
Yeah.
And so when I got married, I got married when I was 19. So, I mean, I was engaged when I was 18, married at 19. And I remember one of my friends saying to me, you know, so how do you get married? You know, like there was no kind of mechanism, you know, it felt like she felt there was no, for a girl who just wants to get married, you know, who just wants to find a way to get married. She didn't know how she could even do that, you know?
And what do you think was missing that they lost their way? What did it seem to you that was missing?
I think her parents expected her to go to clubs, to go to, you know, parties, to go to university,
right?
Meet somebody,
yeah,
and through trial and error, find somebody, you know.
How did you find somebody, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah. So, and this is the thing that I think is missing: a community that facilitates it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So, I'd lived in Egypt for a couple of years.
What took you to Egypt? How did you get there?
Well, after high school, I said to my dad, I want to become an Islamic scholar. I want to study Arabic. I just wanted to understand the Quran in its original language, you know, because, you know, as the word of God, you want to hear it directly, like as it was revealed, not through translations. So I wanted to taste that. And so my dad helped me to go there. He took me there. It was a bit of like going into the unknown a little bit, you know. But I lived there for 2 years. And I think during that time, I felt I would like to get married. You know, I felt quite lonely at times. And I also met somebody there who I considered I wanted to marry. But I think it was more hormones, you know, and stuff like that. But there was always an understanding that marriage is the way forward. You know, there wasn't any kind of extramarital relationship or anything like that. Just maybe talking about marriage. And that didn't really work out, or I kind of lost interest in that. But my parents realized from that it was probably good for them to help me to get married, you know. And I felt I could just tell my parents, and my mom especially. And so when I came back to London, they had a bunch of suitors lined up for me, basically. I mean, you know, it sounds really old-fashioned. It sounds like a Jane Austen novel or something, right? But essentially there was a lady who
Mm-hmm.
she's an author. She's quite well connected in the community, and she knew my mother-in-law, to be right.
Mm-hmm.
She knew my mother-in-law, and she knew that she had two sons. She had a son, and she was looking to get married. So I think what happens is you kind of let people know that
Right.
you're looking for your daughter or son.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, my mom, she just arranged like a meeting outside one day. We happened to be somewhere, so she invited my mother-in-law to be, and my prospective husband at the time, to come and just have like a passing meeting. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we met like that, and then because we were both interested, we had a proper sit-down meeting at home,
Mm-hmm.
and then we visited their house. It was always with my dad,
Yeah.
or with family members,
Mm-hmm.
so chaperoned in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I guess in the course of those meetings, we talked about things. We thrashed out the important things.
Right. Right.
It's very sensible. It's very practical.
And what kind of practical things would you think, like where you want to live, and
Yeah,
if
I was still a
how
student.
many kids you wanted, or I don't know, what were you talking about?
We didn't discuss how many kids we wanted.
No?
I think we had an understanding that, I think, if you're a religious Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
you want to have lots of kids. That's
Right.
just, it
You're
kinda
lucky
goes
to
with
get
it.
any kids. That's right.
Yeah, so I think it's more like you're trying to see if you're both on the same wavelength, in
Uh-huh.
terms of your religious kind of
I see.
practice, and because if you are, you're kind of going to click. A lot of things are going to click probably.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we talked about other, whatever. For example, I wanted to carry on studying.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad was like, yeah, let's put that. Let's talk about that. And there was obviously an attraction there. We had a bit of a back and forth, but quite quickly, since we were happy with it, and we prayed on it, etc.
Mm-hmm.
My husband sent a proposal, an official proposal, and then I accepted. So
Mm-hmm.
it sounds very kind of, I don't know, it's probably the way people used to get married.
I think so. Yeah. That's right.
And I mean, I think the beautiful part of it was you're kind of attracted to one another,
Mm-hmm.
and in love-ish,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But the best part of the being in love happens after you get married.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
because that's when you really can just be free with one another, and so I think, I don't know if you've heard of this idea of post-nuptial depression. There was an article about it in the newspaper.
No, I haven't read about
And
that.
they said that because in modern times people have basically done everything before they got married,
Right.
when they have their wedding, they suffer from a depression afterwards, because
Mm-hmm.
it's like an anticlimax,
Right. 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 I see
So
what you mean.
in that sense, I know that people, when they look at this, the way I've just described somebody getting married, they think of that as a huge risk, or they think, oh, they don't think they could do that, maybe. But actually, I think there's a real beauty in it, because first of all, we were each other's first partners,
Right.
So
Right.
the chances of you clicking are very high, because this is your first experience with the opposite sex,
Mm-hmm. So you're going to learn together.
Yeah. And you're going to fall in love slowly within marriage. So the best of your relationship will happen after the wedding,
Right. And it hasn't been that long in Western society that's the way it was. I mean, my father and mother would be not in their 90s now, and
How did they find one another?
they were married young. They were married young, just out of high school. As far as I know, that was my mother's first boyfriend was my father. And so,
Yeah.
that's not that long ago that it was like that in our society as well. So things have changed very quickly. And I don't think people realize just how far we've come away from our traditional practices, and
Yeah,
that
and also
they're
how,
not very far away. It's not been
yeah,
that long.
it's not been that long, but the changes happened so quickly. And so I just feel like a girl like
Pandora's
Lucy,
box was opened.
yeah, yes, the message was given that marriage wasn't something that was for women, like that actually supported women or protected women, when actually it did. It
Yeah.
was like, for me, I just remember my wedding night and just my early nights, or
Mm-hmm.
days with my husband.
Mm-hmm.
There was like this complete safety in that. Do you know what I mean? Like, when I remember Lucy describing to me how she lost her virginity,
Mm-hmm.
it sounded scary, you know?
Right. Right. Right.
It was really
Mm-hmm.
scary. It was, I think I mean, the way she described it, she wanted to like, it was like she wanted to just rub it out, you know?
Right. Right. Right.
It was at university, somebody, probably alcohol involved, probably.
Probably.
And yes, and probably sort of like unclear as well as to what was going on and then what
Uh-huh.
would happen. And then, but you're kind of going along with it, and then you have to meet that person the next day and there's no connection. You're supposed to have
Right.
no connection. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
my experience of that same thing was the complete opposite. I'm
Mm-hmm.
in a secure home that my husband has provided for me. We are surrounded by gifts where, we're just committed to one another. There's safety. I
Yes.
can't convey that feeling like of safety that was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from that
And
safety, I think that's,
possibility, right? Not just safety, but
yeah,
possibility, because of this new union, and with a common direction. You're married
yeah,
now, and you have a common direction that you're sharing. That's got to be a feeling of safety.
definitely. But even like if we just take it from the physical side of it, the sexual
Mm-hmm.
side of it,
Mm-hmm.
even there's safety. Do you know what I mean? Like the
Yes,
safety to just
absolutely.
to fully express yourself without any fear that
Of
in
being
some way
left, you're going to
of
be
being
left.
left, or that
Yes.
that thing will be used against you in any way.
Right.
Because
Right.
it's
Right.
like nowadays, revenge porn, and I mean, there's so many risks that a girl is taking when she, indulges in that kind of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're married to the person, they see you as part of them. Like you're they so
Mm-hmm.
so they won't compromise you in that way.
Right.
But I think
Right.
because we've divorced that, we've separated the feelings from the sexual side of things, and we've separated that kind of sanctity. We've removed the sanctity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and because of that, men also don't see it as something sacred,
Right. Yes, that's right.
and that's quite sad.
Yes, it is. It's a huge loss, and it isn't just between the man and the woman. It has to do with their children, because
Absolutely.
the children are the outcome of their love, and born in the safety of a family, of a mother and a father.
Did you know that
who knows what profound changes occur when there isn't that safety for a child? Who knows? Genetically, who knows? I'm sure it's deep. I'm sure it's very deep.
You know, there's a statistical, this organization called NatSen in the UK. They said that a million children in the UK have no male figure in their lives.
80% of
at all
kids now in the Black community in the States are born out of wedlock. 80%. So marriage is,
even in the UK,
out.
I think they said this year there was an article that this is the first year when I believe it was that there were more children born outside of marriage than inside.
Yeah,
this was the first year,
and many less and many fewer children. Many fewer children are born, right? Because a woman will do that. What woman is, as a single woman, is going to have 6 children? That's just not going to happen. I can't. I imagine that's a very small percentage of women who would have more than 1 or 2 kids if it's out of wedlock.
Yeah, if they're having to worry about the financial side of things, if they don't have somebody else supporting them as well.
Right.
I think it takes faith to have children,
It takes faith. It takes faith to have children. Yeah, that sounds right.
Like faith in the future, faith in God, faith that you'll be all right. And I remember when I was expecting my first child, there was a magazine, Mum's magazine. I was reading it, and it was like, you should go and make an appointment with your bank manager, and I was kind of laughing at that, thinking, bank manager, because I'm having a child, So there's this kind of constant connection with the material and the lack of material, belongings or provision and children, and people fear. And that's also what I mean by you need to have faith. Like, do you know what I mean? You need to have faith that God will provide, that things will be okay.
Right.
Yeah, and that's why I think you do tend to see people from faith communities do have more children in general. I mean, in the UK, I think I was looking at a statistic that in Europe, Muslim parents or Muslim women have double the number of children that the average woman has. So,
right.
So that's the thing. Like with the Muslim community, there's still quite a lot of traditional values that have still been preserved, but that's not to say that they're not under attack. Because whatever's happening in wider society is also kind of obviously affecting faith communities as well.
Right.
And so I think it's really important I think the book by Louise Perry is very important, Yes. Refreshing. It's very refreshing that she wrote that, because it was kind of a taboo thing to say, right?
Yeah. Well, it's time for us to all talk about these things in a candid way and realize the truth of the reality.
Yeah, because there was a whole campaign, I think, in the 60s and 70s, which was not only about the sexual revolution, telling people that basically free love was going to be good for them, but also very anti-motherhood, equating motherhood with slavery, asking for like this narrative that anyone can look after your kids. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right. There's that too.
There's a book by a psychologist called Steve Biddulph. It's called Raising Babies. And he talks about, it's quite controversial in the sense that he's saying that, look, babies need their parents. Babies need people who love them naturally, If you pay somebody the minimum wage, and they don't have natural love for your child, and they're looking after them from morning till night, you cannot equate that to the love and what's going on between a mother and a child, or even a grandparent and a child.
Well,
It's
and
not equal.
babies don't speak, so you have to be with them to understand them, because
Absolutely.
their communication is very subtle. They cry. That's not so subtle, but their cries are also varied, and the different cries mean different things. And if you're not spending time with your baby, then you don't get to know them
Yeah, because you're so
like you need
attuned to
to.
them, aren't you?
Yes, that's right.
In fact,
That's right.
that's another piece of advice that he gives in his book. He says, if, for example, a mother for some reason can't breastfeed or isn't breastfeeding,
Mm-hmm.
he says that she should bare her breast and hold the baby against her breast as she bottle feeds it.
Yeah, there's something about skin to skin
because it
contact
isn't
that's
just
very
about
important.
food. It's not just about
No,
food,
no, it's
not at
about
all.
touch. Orphaned babies used to die in the orphanages,
Yes,
and there was
because of a lack of touch.
there was a nurse who used to, in one of the orphanages. I can't remember if it was in Germany. I can't remember if it was in England. It was in Europe somewhere, and she used to carry the babies around on her hip. That's just what she did, and her babies lived, and they realized, oh yeah, it has to do more. It's more to do with touch than anything. Little baby rats, if they're not licked and touched, they also die. So
it's about carrying them and just being held, being that safety, that feeling of somebody's there for you. The world is a safe place, right?
Right.
That message.
Right. Yeah, that has to be the message at the beginning. And this idea of free love. I interviewed a women's studies professor who we talked about, a woman named Victoria Woodhull, who was around in the 1700s, and she put forth the idea of free love way back then. So this has been brewing. This idea of free love has been brewing for centuries and been infiltrating our society for a very long time. It really blossomed in the 60s, but that wasn't when it began. It definitely has been here for a long time. So we have to be, I've been going back through the feminist literature. I never studied feminism, but I decided that it was time for me to understand it all and to look at the motivations of the people that we call the mothers of feminism and find out exactly what it was that they were up to, and where we are now in relationship to what they were looking for way back then, and realize that what we say, what we write down, the messages we tell each other, they have consequences, lasting consequences. We have to be very, very careful.
Absolutely.
When people are listening to God and getting their answers from, getting their inspiration from God, that's one thing. But when you're reading books, and these books were written in the spirit of resentment, or this, then that's the direction that things are going to go. So we have to be super careful when we read books to find out who these people are, what their lives were like, what their motivations were, who they were getting their information from. It's complicated, and without a family, without a mother and a father to be guiding you in what books you're reading as a child, that's super important. It's all just so important.
Well, I think also some of the ladies who were like spearheading, the women's movement, etc., I don't think they really knew what they were doing themselves. Do you know what I mean?
No,
I don't think it's
not
necessarily because they had this big master plan. It wasn't really like that. It was more like, it was, I think, another manifestation of individualism, but a gendered one,
Yeah, right.
A gendered I remember hearing Germaine Greer. She's one of the kind of big sort of second wave feminists.
Yeah.
She, in this documentary, she said, well, liberation didn't happen I mean, I think a lot of them are kind of realizing and admitting that, and she said sexual liberation didn't happen. She said what happened was commercial pornography was liberated, fantasy was liberated, but people weren't liberated. So even people like her admit that things have gotten worse for women. That's literally what she was saying.
Right.
And there's a book by a feminist called Kat Banyard, and she says in it that, it's called The Equality Illusion.
Okay.
The Equality Illusion. And she says, today, women's and girls' bodies are denigrated as inanimate objects to be scrutinized, judged, manipulated, maintained for the benefit of others. And she says women have become like shared public property.
Well, women evaluate each other's appearance, whereas men evaluate what other men do. But women evaluate what other women look like. And so the idea that we've been, the scrutinizing of appearance and manipulation of appearance has come from, it looks like it has come from a natural interest in who you are, how you carry yourself, the gracefulness of a woman, even, that it's all to be seen. It's all to be seen. And this has become complicated. It's become complicated in our complicated world.
Yeah. So in our community, for example, like, although I'm dressed like this, when I met you, I wasn't wearing a face veil, right?
No.
I don't usually wear a face veil on the streets, etc. I just prefer it on camera, like just as an extra privacy, I guess, like just to preserve my. But even so, it's only really when we're in public or when we are in the presence of certain men who are not related to us that Muslim women, cover in a certain way. And even Muslim men have rules for, guidelines for dress as well, like in front of the opposite sex. And then, but when we're in our homes, if you were to come and visit me at home, or if we were in a ladies only gathering, and we tend to have those, quite a lot of like ladies only spaces and men's only spaces as well.
Right.
Then I think you'd be quite surprised, because we wear makeup, we dress, if in Western clothes or in Indian clothes, depending on your culture. And we enjoy the similar things,
Right.
But we just have a particular space for it. And
right. So it's within a very confined community. It's not so widespread. So it becomes so widespread. Yes.
So if it was like women's only, we have women's only parties, for example, or we'll have like a space for the women and a space for the men.
Yes.
And in those spaces, we're quite free, like it's not uncommon to go to a wedding where people are dancing, women are dancing together. And, that's quite, people who haven't seen us, they assume that we dress like this all the time, but no, it's just in the public space. It's just, in some ways you could see it as a uniform,
So when you go to a wedding, when you go to a wedding, so you would dress in a more, I guess I would say a Western style, but I don't know how you would describe it, but without putting on your hijab. And when you dance, do you dance men and women together at a wedding?
So what I would wear...
Is there dancing?
I would wear clothes, nice clothes, like wedding clothes for a wedding.
Wedding clothes. Yeah.
Most of the weddings I go to are Asian weddings, Indian, Pakistani weddings. So, we have very ornate clothes with bangles and jewelry and makeup and everything. But I would wear that underneath some kind of overcoat, like not a thick coat, but just like almost like a cloth almost. And even like my hijab. And then when I get to the venue, I would remove the outer, that's what Muslim women do. They would remove their outer garments. And so I guess there's like a private world and a public world in that sense. And it is very nice. I mean, I personally didn't grow up in a culture where dancing was much of a thing, but a lot of my Arab friends, they definitely did. So when you go to an Arab wedding, they're definitely dancing, and they'll encourage you to join. So but yeah, it's just, I remember even like some of my friends at school would be quite surprised that, so they're like these two worlds, and if you ever get to, one of my friends, she became a Muslim. Her name is Lauren, and she said that initially when she came to women's only settings, she thought, this is going to be boring, right? That was like her initial reaction, because she was so used to mixed settings. But one of the things she told me was, for the first time, she really enjoyed female company, and she felt like there was this sisterhood, and they weren't competing for any kind of male attention. So there was this kind of, it was very relaxed,
Yeah, I do more and more, and I talked a little bit about this with Louise Perry when we spoke about schools, not just schools, but schools in particular, girls' schools and boys' schools. And I've talked to other people since, and some of the people have said, well, what about girls' classrooms and boys' classrooms? And then the boys and girls could play together at recess. And so the thing is, people used to have large families, right? So boys and girls could play together as sisters and brothers. And so then girls and boys would understand one another within the family. But now that families have got so small that if sometimes there'll be an only child in a family. And if they can't play with kids of the opposite sex, then they don't understand the opposite sex at all. I don't know how to play with them. So that's been another consequence of the birth rate going down so much too, is that the idea of having segregated school is awkward, I guess, more awkward than it used to be. I think it's a great idea that wherever I've worked that have been only women, it's much more relaxed. It's much more carefree. The humor is much more flowing. But as soon as there's one person of the opposite sex, the whole dynamics of the situation change, and it becomes.
So in Canada, do you still?
Sorry.
Do you still have girls' schools and boys' schools in Canada?
Yeah, there are girls' schools and boys' schools. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
In
But
Britain, it's getting,
not often. Not often.
Yeah, it's changing slowly. Like some girls' schools are becoming what they call co-ed.
Yes.
But what's interesting is even the co-ed schools, the schools with the boys and the girls, the secondary ones, so in other words, high school, they're actually segregating maths and science, which is quite interesting. Right? Yeah, yeah. It's actually a thing now in Britain that for maths, and I believe science as well. Well, PE, naturally, people tend to think, PE will have it separate.
Yes,
PE,
right.
Physical education. But with even with maths and science, because what they're finding is this, I don't know how to explain this, but they're saying that girls tend to downplay their ability in maths and science when they're in mixed settings, which I don't really understand. Yeah. So in order to encourage girls in the STEM subjects, they're actually saying that having separate classes makes both sexes actually strive and perform better for some reason. I don't know why, but
well, I think
quite interesting.
part of it, and maths and sciences, maybe it's just more obvious. It's a more obvious detriment to the kids' concentration in those
yeah, that could be
in
as well.
those subjects, because those subjects take a lot of concentration. You have to be on point to figure out the problem, and
Not be distracted.
and not be distracted.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because it is very distracting to have boys and girls together. And everybody knows that if they think for a minute about the time that they spent in school as little kids, that, well, anytime, I don't know, if boys still have boys hockey teams, and they have only boys in the dressing room. And so everybody has, I would hope that everybody has something that they can remember that is from a time where it was only women or only men, and how the dynamics are different than when there's both sexes together, because it is complicated. It complicates the situation. And I think that I'm hoping that we can recognize that, because it gives girls and boys much better chance of understanding what they're doing if they're not distracted by each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right about that. One of my research, I just finished my master's research. It was into female converts to Islam in the UK. And that was very interesting, because I was interested to hear from them, like in the current climate and in the past decade, I would say, since 9/11, Islam has had such bad press, right? Like,
right.
To put it mildly. So you would think, like, why would these women be attracted to Islam? Because people have a lot of misconceptions about it. I think a lot of people don't even realize how, Muslims believe in the prophets from the Bible, and they, there's so much similarity and so much congruence there. Because there's so many kind of false narratives as well that are out there. Yes. And because, of the actions of some Muslims, Muslims tend to get demonized. So I was interested to hear from these people who basically had embraced Islam since 9/11, since that whole period, and to hear from especially the women, like, what were some of the reasons, what was their journey. And I was looking at a particular legal element, which is quite complicated, but just from hearing from them, I think it made it very clear to me that I really wanted to share the Islamic worldview with women in the wider society as an alternative, because a lot of the women who I interviewed, and they were all like British, I think all of them were white. One of them was mixed race, Italian and Jamaican, I think. Yeah. But all of the women who I interviewed, there were certain themes that kept coming up, as to what attracted them. One of the things was definitely the kind of direct relationship with God that featured quite a lot, especially with Catholics. I mean, people who had been Catholics, I think they appreciated that kind of not having an intermediary, and just being able to talk to God and access God. Also, there was another theme that kept coming up, and that was the gender roles. And that was really interesting to me, because some of the women were saying, I just wanted clarity about how to be a woman, like in modern times. And I appreciated the clarity, that Islam gave in terms of like, roles and responsibilities.
Roles and responsibilities, yeah.
Yeah. Some of the women, I think, their journey was very fraught as well, like sometimes their families were not happy about it. Often they discovered Islam through other Muslims, who they had either worked with or even taught at school, which was interesting. Like there were a couple of them were teachers who had taught Muslim kids, and there was another group of women who had quite traumatic lives, for example, a lot of alcohol abuse in their parents, so growing up they had seen a lot of alcohol abuse, and they had also fallen into, either they went into care, or they had fallen into like very unhealthy relationships with men in their early lives, even had been sexually assaulted, or had some kind of traumatic thing happen to them. Right. And what was interesting to me was, so when they either came across a Muslim who introduced Islam to them, or they visited a Muslim home, like one girl in particular, I remember, her parents were alcoholics, and she got taken into care because of it. Because one day she was wandering outdoors and she got hit by a car.
Oh dear.
As a kid,
Oh dear.
I mean, it was really like shocking story, but she ended up in care, and she was basically, when you're in care in Britain, I don't know if it's like that in Canada, but it basically means nobody's looking after you in a way, because then she was, in and out. Nobody knew where she was. She ended up pregnant. She had a baby. So she went through quite a lot in her personal life, and there were a few people like that, who then, when they discovered Islam, either through a Muslim, and they went to their home and they saw like what they said, a family could be like.
Right.
Or they met Muslim men, and they, I was surprised by this, but they said that they treated them differently, in their particular situations. They'd always experienced men who either took advantage of them or wanted a relationship. But when they saw that, the gender roles and things like that, it really attracted them to Islam, and they would access, the Muslim community some way. And what was interesting is some of them had very supportive families, but often, they were faced with rejection from their families for adopting Islam. So yeah, it was really interesting hearing the women's stories, and it's quite moving. It was quite, yeah, and in a strange way, many of them had written off religion. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right,
they didn't see any religion as an option. They'd gotten to that point, so they'd either become atheists or just disenchanted, and so for them to then do like a 180, right, and rediscover, that, okay, something that they could embrace. I think it was, I thought they were very brave, actually, because many of them, they're treated like traitors.
Mm-hmm.
by that's in their own words,
Sure.
by people who don't understand,
Mm-hmm.
or who think of Islam as being very different, the other. So they went through a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
almost, in fact, all of them, when I asked them, was it worth it? Because some of them, they had to leave marriages because
Mm-hmm.
their husbands were not happy with them, being Muslim. They each of them said yes, it was because they had a relationship with God, and I think that was the most important.
Reason
That
for
whole
their change. Mm-hmm.
that hole had been filled.
Right,
That
exactly.
connection with God, because once you have that, I think you can weather any storm.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And Christianity, I think that we have the possibility of having the same sort of resurgence of faith and following biblical, ethical lifestyles, but there is such a movement away from this, to have guidelines that can give you hope and keep you feeling safe and giving you courage to do the right
Yeah.
thing.
And a certain level of certainty, right? Like,
Yeah.
in order to step forward in life confidently, you need certainty about what you're stepping into and how you're stepping forward, right?
Yeah.
And I was telling you about Lucy. I just always felt at every stage she was unsure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Society's telling her to do a certain thing, but her instincts and her kind of inner voice doesn't like that thing, but there's
Right.
no other way. There's no other way
Yeah.
presented to her as an option.
No, and we're not told to pay attention to that inner voice. We're not.
Yeah, in
We're
fact,
not. We're not said it's good to pay attention to that inner voice.
we either quieten it,
Right.
or we think, oh, that's just my inhibition, right? Like, as if that's a bad thing.
Yeah, we've read. Well, I don't know. We have to talk about these things because we've lost our adherence to our traditional ethics, and our societies are now, they're people are, like you said, they're unbounded. They're uncertain about their decisions that they're making, whether they should go this way or that way, and they don't feel grounded and certain in their and sure of the next step. And there is a way to feel that certainty. It's to go back to our founding fathers, back to, for our society, back to the Bible, for your society, back to the Quran, and to take these behavioral rules seriously, meditate on them, see what feels right, and move forward day by day, and make the decisions that we need to make so that we feel a sense of peace in our bodies. Because this whole idea of being so uncertain and skeptical, and it's not, it won't lead you to the right place, and of course you'll get into trouble, right? Of course you will.
Well, I think it's important that, I don't know how if you've ever thought of this, but as Muslims, I think we see Islam as a continuation of the message of those before us,
Right.
So it's not like a different thing,
No.
It's a continuation. So
the stories are similar, no matter.
Yeah.
When I read the Bible and you talk about the Quran, it weaves together. It weaves together because you can hear the stories repeat in different cultures and in different religions, because the stories they come from a place of truth. The stories are going to come out and be related.
I think they come from the same source.
Yeah.
So like, for the way I would look at it is that God throughout time has sent messengers to guide people back, to guide people back to the straight path.
Yeah.
After Adam, with Noah, that's exactly what was happening. The same message, the same essential message, but a different law, to go with it. So God tells us in the Quran that, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus were all sent with the same essential core message, which is worship God and follow me, follow whatever law I've come with. That they didn't come to dismantle the law. They followed the law themselves. They might have come with some modifications and things, but they followed it themselves. And I think one of the problems is that people don't think they have to follow the law, I mean, God's law. And that's been so, and that doesn't play out in the lives of the messengers themselves, the prophets themselves. They actually followed the law themselves. So I think that idea of not following the law or not needing to follow the law, that came later. It wasn't something that they taught.
No.
And actually, the Quran actually says that directly. The Quran actually mentions Jesus, peace be upon him, over 20 times. And I think one of the purpose of the Quran was to clarify some of what are seen as the misconceptions that people had about Jesus and his status. Because in the Quran, God says that Jesus was a messenger from God. He was a blessed messenger from God. He was born of a virgin birth. He was the Messiah who was promised to the children of Israel, who would come. He came and he was trying to bring people back to the law where they had stopped following the law. And he came with certain dispensations, so making some things easier in the law. And in his time, people rejected him. People wouldn't follow him, and they saw him as a threat. And so they tried to have him killed. But in the Quran, we believe that Jesus was not killed. That's actually what Muslims believe.
I see.
Jesus was raised up to heaven. God protected him, and he was raised up to heaven. And that somebody else was crucified in his place. And so when he appeared a few days later, people were confused about his status. Had he been crucified and then brought back, or had he never been crucified, etc., etc. So one of the key messages of the Quran is to clarify the status of Jesus. And the clarification is that he was a blessed messenger of God, one of the greatest messengers of God. His mother was a virgin. He was created through God's word. And he came with certain laws and certain, and the children of Israel were supposed to follow him and supposed to obey him, but that they didn't. And because of that rejection, and because of they're trying to kill him. And by the way, we believe that Jesus will return as well. That's a part of Islamic doctrine as well, that he is with God, that he will return. We believe because they rejected Jesus and they didn't accept him as the Messiah, and they tried to kill him, that prophethood went from the family of Isaac, because Jesus was a descendant of Isaac, into the family of Ishmael. And that's why the Prophet Muhammad is...
Yeah, right. I see. So then he was the next messenger.
Yes, and he came to clarify.
I guess we understand Jesus' story as Jesus being the most innocent man, dying the most terrible death, being being deceived by his best friend, he was a good man. He was misunderstood by the state, by the people.
Yes.
So he was just separate. He was misunderstood in as many ways as someone could be misunderstood. Yet he stayed fast to his belief, and he came through that. And I think in everyone's life, we all wonder how we are insufficient, right? We all wonder how we have the mistakes that we've made, and with faith, if we can admit what our mistakes, admit that we are insufficient, insufficient in as many ways as anyone has been, so to have humility,
absolutely,
then the next morning we can come through that and start afresh again. And
you're right.
I do believe that his story, the story, and I know I've been going to church, to the Catholic Church. I was raised a Protestant, which is more a direct relationship with God through the Protestant religion. But I've been going to Catholic Church, and partly because the Protestant Church has become it's not true to the traditions right now. It's been infiltrated by the modern culture, and so that church isn't easy to go to anymore. And finding a church where they're still staying true to God's word is where I want to go, and what I want to hear. And so there are some Catholic churches and some Orthodox churches where you can still find that they're reading scripture and just not veering away from it at all, and so keeping it as God's word. It's I'm not a scholar, a religious scholar. I'm really somebody who's come to understand the necessity of living by God's word later in my life, but I do really strongly believe it. And
What made you?
Well,
what brought you to
every
that
day,
realization?
every day I see miracles because of my, because I can pause and meditate and find God's word. Then I can see miracles that appear in the natural world, which is what Scripture tells you will happen, and it can happen.
Yeah.
But you can't follow idols at the same time, right? So you have to be very careful that you're not attaching yourself to other what are they? They're easier ways, I guess. They're easier ways, or they're seductive ways, or they're, you know, it's hard to stay pious, and I understand, you know, the Muslims, by covering themselves, it's very a feeling of safety, a feeling of and also an outward appearance to remind you that you're with God.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's actually a book called Covering the Moon. There's a book called
Moon.
Covering the Moon, and it's about veils in Christianity and Judaism. You know, and how they used to be. So, I mean, even if you think about like Mary, you know, whenever she's portrayed, I think it was one of the ministers in Italy, when there was all this talk about banning the hijab, you know, he said, how can I ban something that whenever I look at a picture of Mary, I see that she's wearing, you know?
Right.
I think we've just forgotten and we've lost touch.
I think we've forgotten and lost touch. Yes, exactly. We've forgotten.
But I really appreciate your journey, and it's been really enlightening and talking to you as well, and just following your journey, and especially through your illness, you know, when we were all rooting for you.
Yes, thank you very much. I
And
think
praying
it
for
really
you.
made all the difference.